يعني العقوبات عديدة، وأنا أقول بكل وضوح إسرائيل يجب أن تكون في عزلة دولية بسبب سياستها، وأن تفرض عليها عقوبات وأن تقدم للمساءلة.
Why hasn't the UN given any current resolutions on the Israel-Palestine conflict? Is it safe to deduce that the UN is hesitant to give further attention to the crisis?
I think when we talk about the UN, we have to ask which UN we're talking about, because there's the UN of the member states, and 193 members, including Indonesia, all are sovereign states, and they vote and they take the decisions that they take. The point is that, the only way this situation is going to be solved so that civilians and mothers and children in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Israel can actually live in peace is by the two sides sitting down together and talking. And sadly, we have not seen that in recent years. In any conflict, the people who pay the highest price are civilians. And that's something that we see throughout the world.
Halo teman kumparan, to the point kali ini bersama saya Alia Bunga. 15 April lalu, Israel melakukan agresi di kompleks Masjid Al-Aqsa yang mengundang berbagai kecaman dari warga dunia. Tidak berhenti di situ, Israel justru kembali melakukan serangan udara di wilayah selatan jalur Gaza. Israel berdalih serangan tersebut merupakan balasan dari roket yang ditembakkan Palestina. Sementara tensi semakin memanas di antara Israel dan Palestina, konflik serupa di antara Rusia dan Ukraina belum juga reda. Lalu bagaimana Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa atau PBB menyikapi hal ini? Telah bergabung secara virtual Mr. Steven Dujarric selaku juru bicara dari Sekretaris Jenderal PBB. Greetings Mr. Dujarric. Hello. How are you?
Hello. Very well. Very nice to be with you.
Mr. Dujarric, let's get to the point. Okay. So the first question is, the UN was very swift in actions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In less than a week, the General Assembly came up with a resolution to condemn the attack. About a month later, it was suspended from the Human Rights Council of Russia. So why hasn't the UN showed the same swiftness in responding to the Israel's attacks in Gaza and Al-Aqsa, at least since 2018?
Well, I mean, let's take a step back. I think what you're referring to in terms of Ukraine are decisions taken by member states, right? I can speak for the Secretary General, not for those member states who take different positions and vote. On Ukraine, the Secretary General was very swift in calling for this invasion to stop. He has been very much focused on trying to find a diplomatic solution. Just yesterday, he wrote to the Russian president and the Ukrainian president about the offering to go in person to both Moscow and Kiev to see how this war can be ended. In parallel, we have mobilized our humanitarian system and have more than 1,000 people in Ukraine delivering aid and trying to bring humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. Now, if you look at the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, again, member states vote, make decisions in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and that's not for me to speak on. The Secretary General has been very clear in calling for a stop to provocative actions around the holy sites. He is very keen to see the status quo being kept for Jerusalem, which, as you know, is sacred to Jews, Christians, and of course to Muslims as well. We want to see an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we will do whatever we can to bring that about.
So the next question will be regarding the UN have made any resolutions, right, concerning Israel in 2017, but for Palestine it was in 2018. Why hasn't the UN given any current resolutions on the Israel-Palestine conflict? Is it safe to deduce that the UN is hesitant to give further attention to the crisis?
You know, I think when we talk about the UN, we have to ask which UN we're talking about, because there's the UN of the member states, and 193 members, including Indonesia, all are sovereign states, and they vote and they take the decisions that they take. We do not influence those decisions. What we know is that this crisis continues to be unresolved after decades. And the longer it continues, as we see, the more complicated it gets. And so we are, through the Secretary General, through his representative on the ground, keeps trying to bring those parties together. We want to see, in the end, two states, Israel and Palestine, live in peace and security side by side. We believe that there are a number of things that need to happen, and whether it's the Israelis or the Palestinians, they need to follow UN resolutions that have been voted. But we are very much dedicated in trying to appease this conflict and bring an end to it.
And could you please tell us what is the UN stance on the most current attack that started in the Gaza? Why hasn't it given any strong official statements regarding the matter?
Well, I think the Secretary General did. He gave a very strong statement yesterday, expressing his deep concern about the ongoing violence around the holy sites. We have repeatedly, condemned the use by Hamas of indiscriminate rocket fire into Israel, hitting civilian targets. We've also expressed our concern about Israeli airstrikes and the damage they cause to civilians in Gaza. The point is that, the only way this situation is going to be solved so that civilians and mothers and children in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Israel can actually live in peace is by the two sides sitting down together and talking. And sadly, we have not seen that in recent years.
Mr. Dujarric, Israel has been formally condemned by the UN more than 100 times. What does the UN hope to achieve by condemning Israel? How effective has it been thus far?
Look, I completely appreciate the questions you're asking, but you're unfortunately you're asking the wrong person, because the Secretary General does not have a vote in the General Assembly or in the Security Council. So it is incumbent on every member state to follow resolutions and to adhere to those resolutions. But frankly, I think you need to ask others who represent countries as opposed to the Secretariat these questions.
Okay. Mr. Dujarric, we have a question from our readers. The question is there a difference between the Ukraine and Palestine conflict, and according to the UN assessment? What targets regarding in the two conflicts?
Well, I mean, listen, it's not to me to do a compare and contrast exercise. In any conflict, the people who pay the highest price are civilians, and that's something that we see throughout the world. We are very concerned about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, not just because of what is going on in Ukraine, but of the ripple effects it will have on the global economy. And we're already seeing food prices go up. We're seeing energy prices go up, which I think your readers all know all too well. And the conflict in Israel and Palestine continues to be, something that is destabilizing to a region. And so, there's too many. One conflict is one conflict too many. And what the Secretary General's efforts is to find diplomatic and political solutions to these conflicts.
The state of Palestine has been formally recognized by the UN and other 138 countries since 2012. What is the UN planning to do to protect one of its observer non-members, both immediate and long-term?
Well, as you know, Palestine has observer status at the UN. Our focus, again, is on trying to bring peace between these peoples, right? And the only way to do it is to see a stop to incitement to violence, to see a stop to acts of terror that we have seen, notably a recent campaign in lines of terrorist attacks in Israel, and to bring the parties together. We've also been very clear about the need to stop the settlement process. Again, and I'm sorry to be kind of repeating myself, but the issue is really about bringing the parties together to sit down and come to an agreement based on previous Security Council and United Nations resolutions and international law.
Mm-hmm. It's okay, Mr. Jarek. We really appreciate your answers.
No.
Now, let's talk about the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Moscow right now is insisting on meeting with the UN to discuss what happened in Bucha earlier this month. According to Moscow, this is nothing but a provocation from Ukraine. They plan to present empirical evidence to defend themselves. How will the UN react to the claim, and what should be expected to come out from the meeting?
What we will have is, we have currently our human rights experts and investigators and monitors in Ukraine, including in Bucha. We expect this report to be issued publicly sooner rather than later, and then we will see what conclusions we can bring. But we have people on the ground who are monitoring human rights violations, including possible mass killings.
Mm-hmm. Since Russia has been suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council, how would UN attend the investigation back in Ukraine objectively?
Well, objectively, we have, so again, it's the separation between, on one hand, the member states, and on one hand, the Secretariat. So the member states took the decision to remove Russia from the council. The Russians also said they were leaving. They decided to resign. That's one thing. We have, through the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have a mandate, and we were invited in by the Ukrainian government to have human rights monitors. So these are impartial monitors who work for the United Nations. They will report on what they have seen. They will report on the discussions they have had with the survivors of these horrific incidents. And they will put out a report that will be no doubt public, and it will be for everyone to then judge.
Thank you. Mr. Jarek, Russia is part of the P5 members in the UN, which gives it a lot of power than other non-permanent countries. For example, in February 26th, the Kremlin blocked the Security Council's action on Ukraine. And how would exactly the UN be able to deal with the crisis in Ukraine while granting Russia the veto power for any future actions?
Well, you know, who gets to stay a member of the UN, who gets to be a member of the UN, which countries, those are decisions that member states themselves have to take. Russia, as you said, is a member of the P5. It is a founding member of the UN, and so, you know, that's, member states are going to have to work with each other within the structures of the UN. We believe that the universal membership of the United Nations is critical to its legitimacy. It is really the only organization that has universal membership, and I think it is very important to preserve that membership.
As price for food, fertilizer, oil, gas, and some metals are skyrocketing due to conflict, the world is at risk for a global food crisis. So the question is, what is the UN going to do about this tremendous threat in the long term or immediate?
It is a huge concern of the Secretary General.
Yeah.
One of the things he's been doing, he's pushing the international banks, World Bank, the IMF, to put in place financial instruments to help developing nations, because we know developing nations have a fiscal space that is narrower than richer countries. It is vital, and this is something we're pushing, that markets remain open, that we don't see closures of food markets. We don't see ban on export markets. The international trade in food needs to be open and needs to continue. And we call on member states to avoid any sort of preemptive hoarding or stockpiling of food that will only drive prices higher. There is also an opportunity to move faster into clean energy and to move away from fossil fuels, to be less dependent on fossil fuel supplies, which are only really in a handful of countries.
Now we're going to talk about the Ukrainian refugees. The conflict has effectively displaced at least 10.5 million Ukrainians. The UN Human Rights Council has been offering humanitarian assistance like wherever necessary and possible. For example, giving cash for food and rent, delivering supplies, providing beds and other immediate aid. And does the UN have any long-term plans to deal with this big number of newly displaced people?
Well, the long-term plan is that we have to keep dealing with it as long as the numbers are there. This is why our diplomatic efforts to try to bring an end to the conflict, which will then bring an end to the immediate humanitarian crisis, is so important. We need to salute the generosity of those countries that have absorbed millions of people in a very short amount of time. But the only way to end this crisis is really by ending the war.
Mr. Jubir, this will be our one last question.
Right.
And we shall talk about the current situation in Ukraine. So how did the UN respond to the second phase of the Russian war right now in the Donbas region earlier this week? Ukraine claims to have... Okay, I'm sorry. Wait, shall I continue?
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Ukraine claims to have predicted that this second phase will indeed occur. Does the UN know that as well? So what actions have the UN taken?
We're obviously very concerned about the renewed fighting. Just 2 days ago, the Secretary General put out a call for a humanitarian truce during Orthodox Easter, which is this weekend. We feel that these 4 days should be a period of reflection, of silencing the guns, which would enable us to bring humanitarian aid in to help civilians leave and be the first building block towards ending this conflict.
Okay, that would be all. Thank you so much, Mr.
You're so welcome.
We really
Take care.
appreciate it, regardless how brief it may be. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, have a good day. Teman kumparan, demikian perbincangan kami dengan Mr. Steven Dujari selaku juru bicara dari Sekretaris Jenderal PBB. Saksikan berbagai tayangan wawancara eksklusif kumparan lainnya di website dan YouTube kumparan. Saya Alia Bunga beserta segenap tim yang bertugas pamit undur diri. Terima kasih dan sampai jumpa.